Ever since Detective Comics issues 608 and 609, the terms anarchy, anarchy, and chaos have meant three very different things. And since those issues back in 1989, the term within the Batman and larger DC mythos has shifted significantly in ways closely reflecting the real world. So, let's get into how anarchy reflects the demonization of anarchism after 9/11, the co-opting of terms by the right wing, and the increasing radicalization of our youth.
Oppressed citizens of Gotham, your cries for help have been heard. I am Anarchy, voice of the people, here to save you from the plague of corruption that now infests this once proud city.
I feel like before we can even start to get into any kind of analysis, I do need to lay down the groundwork of this essay and what we're going to build upon for the entire time. Let's define some terms. Anarchy is typically defined in one of two ways. The first being a form of anti-statism, in which believers believe that there should not be a government and every person should be given full self-determination free of any form of government interference or interference from any sort of structural power. This can also go hand in hand with the belief that all people are inherently good when given the chance. While inherently a system that is partyless because it strives for the dismantlement of government, the beliefs of anarchists tend to align more so with leftists. The second definition is that of total chaos. With this, we'll be discussing the shift of anarchy from falling much more in line with the first definition into reflecting the second. Anarchy is a character who originated in Detective Comics number 608, real name Lonnie Mackin. Radicalized after hearing about the horrors of war in a third world country from his childhood pen pal, he read about the tenets of anarchism and eventually decided that he wanted to try and change the world by making the voice of the people of Gotham City heard. He did this by donning a costume and enacting what he saw as justice against the people who've hurt the public in Gotham. Often, this put him in a position of opposition against Batman. But let's make one thing clear about that. Anarchy is not a villain. He was never designed to be one. He is occasionally an antagonist, which is notably different. He opposes Batman because Batman seeks to uphold the systems at B which Anarchy seeks to disrupt. However, both of them acknowledge that the other is doing what he believes is the right thing. They respect each other. Or at least Anarchy respects Batman. Batman is quite often just straight up mean to Anarchy despite the fact that he's a teenager. Aside from acknowledging that Anarchy is not a villain, there are some other things about his role within the narrative that are important to address. Anarchy is an incredibly political character. He was always meant to be a mouthpiece for his creator's own belief system, even more so than other political characters. As he tells Green Arrow in one issue, the radicals of one generation will be the conservatives in the next. Anarchy is the modern radical, too bold for this generation, but maybe not for the next. And generally, he's also just Alan Grant's favorite original character to do whatever he wanted to. Because of this, he was at times a little bit of a Mary Sue. He really did let him do anything. A lot of the time when I talk about Anarchy, my friends assume I'm talking about like an OC or something, because a lot of what Lonnie does in his solos resembles what a fan fiction OC would be doing, like Alan Grant. Excuse me. He's 15 years old. How did he build a boom tube? And he's the son of one of the most influential characters in the Batman mythos. Because why not? He's a Mary Sue and I love him for it. Quite often, Mackin was paired with Robin number 3, and after years of being antagonistic, they eventually built a friendship during Red Robin. The two of them always had a level of respect for each other and, early on, displayed the idea of being friends if things were different. And when things were different, they considered each other their best friend. For a while, the role of Anarchy was not inhabited by its creator. Ulysses Hadrian Armstrong, better known as the General, originated during the time of Nightfall and believed that a militaristic way was the best way to go. Armstrong is hungry for glory and violence, and in a way to get that, he incapacitated and kidnapped Mackin, the original Anarchy, and forced him to work for him, all so that he could be Robin number 3's greatest nemesis. He thought that Anarchy was taking that position from him, so after first taking up the mask of Red Robin, Armstrong took on the role of Anarchy instead. Safe to say, it didn't work out for his intentions. Probably because Anarchy was never Robin's greatest nemesis. They were tentative allies, even. Armstrong is going to be very important to this essay. We will come back to him shortly.
It's from the crime scene Penguin mentioned.
I was hoping you get a minute of your time. See, I've got a story to tell you. About crime and violence. Greed and vengeance. But it's also a story of redemption. Of second chances. Of change.
From the late 80s onward, every time that Anarchy showed up, he was, to some degree, trying to incite social change. That was his goal. He was an activist more than anything else. It just happened that a lot of the time his activism fell in line with vigilantism. Then, in the early aughts, he just disappears. He stops appearing. Writers don't pull him out of the toolbox. He's entirely missing for a good few years. And when is it that he disappears? Right around September of 2001. His last appearance before 2005 is in September of 2001. Isn't that interesting? For a while following the events of 9/11, Critique of the government was at an all-time low. Bush's approval ratings were through the roof. While there was definitely still counterculture movements, talk of these and other things quote-unquote un-American were suddenly very taboo in the media, so using a character like Anarchy in stories would have been heavily frowned upon, especially since this was still in the days of the Comics Code Authority. And as time went on, these counterculture movements were more and more frowned upon and villainized. Anarchism was not very popular, especially in the eyes of the systems they opposed. Writing Anarchy was a potentially risky move during the War on Terror. Then, the return of Anarchy coincided pretty perfectly with the years following the beginning of the War on Terror. When support of the US government was dropping off a cliff, as Bush's ratings went down into the 30s, Anarchy returned. All of a sudden, it was okay to criticize again, and so Anarchy returned. But he did not return unchanged. He seriously reemerged in 2009, the same year Obama was inaugurated. And things were notably different. This was not the Anarchy of the 90s. It literally was not the Anarchy of the 90s. It was the general, the character whose entire thing was the military and the state. The very things Anarchy seeked to disrupt. Armstrong's takeover of Anarchy was exactly the demonization the real world had been experiencing. He turned Anarchy into a villain, into someone just out to cause chaos and destruction and nothing else. There is also definitely something to be said about the fact Armstrong did a comic book equivalent of a political assassination against Mackin. Armstrong represents the right-wing status quo shooting down the radical dreamers. And from that point on, it seemed that whenever Anarchy showed up, he was a villain. The character assassination had succeeded. Arrow is probably the worst representation of this. I watched the first episode Anarchy appeared in Arrow, and it hurt me badly. He was a chaos junkie who reveled in violence, torture, and death. That is not Lonnie Mackin. Mackin never killed. He valued human life. That was why he did what he did, because he believed in the sanctity of life and that everyone had a right to live out that life however they saw fit, and not at the expense of others. But where the Batman had Mackin show contempt for logic, when really logic is what led Anarchy to the conclusions he made, he saw things that horrified him. Then he followed the trail back to the people who caused it. From there, he made conclusions based on logic and morals that Arrow's Anarchy was told not to have. He is no longer the revolutionary or the radical. He's a bomb-throwing anarchist. Modern Anarchy is hardly Lonnie Mackin. It's Ulysses Armstrong in another stolen name, which doesn't track with the truth of Anarchy at any point. During late Preboot, he was even directly working with one of our heroes. He played an Oracle-like role for Red Robin, something you would not catch a villain doing, even if Red Robin felt a little more morally gray during this point. When he was first introduced, he was a very strong candidate to be the Robin after Jason Todd. He's a good person. Hell, I'd make the case for him being lawful good. The laws he follows just don't happen to line up with the actual laws. Characters can have moral codes that don't strictly align with the role they play in the story. The protagonist isn't always the good guy, and the antagonist isn't always the villain. You get it, I'm sure. Despite the fact that DC is positively rolling in stories where the Bats become dictators, only really twice have they utilized the fact that within Batman mythos exists a character whose entire goal is to take down fascists. Once, in Shadow of the Bat Annual number 2, where Anarchy tried to stop Scarecrow from manipulating Batman into putting chemicals into the Gotham City water supply to make its citizens more subservient and less intelligent. The other time was in the Titans Tomorrow timeline, where Tim Drake was an evil, murderous Batman, and Anarchy tried to make him see reason. However, this failed and he was ultimately killed by Drake. Unfortunately, this isn't the only time that Mackin was killed off. In the first issue of I Am Batman, it's revealed that Anarchy has been killed. Taking place in 2022, I feel that Anarchy was killed right before we needed him most as a character. When we need a character like Anarchy, he is nowhere to be found. We've been seeing a lot more Armstrongs than Mackins, which leads into my next point.
Tell you what, I'll turn myself in as soon as you do the same. But you don't consider yourself a criminal, do you? The suit, the gadgets, the sense of entitlement. You're just another rich kid atoning for his fiscal sins. Such a shame.
This essay was going to be mostly about Lonnie, but it quickly became about both Anarchies. And my point here is that there's two Anarchies at all. What Armstrong did to Mackin in 2009 is a pretty perfect example of when the right wing takes terms used by the left and twists them into reflections of their own fascistic beliefs instead, often almost as a way of mocking what the terms originally were meant to represent. The first IRL example that comes to mind is the bastardization of Black Lives Matter into quote-unquote Blue Lives Matter, which directly took what the Black Lives Matter stood for and twisted it into the opposite. The people who coined this term knew what they were doing. They knew why Black Lives Matter came to be. And so they took that term and ran with it. Explicitly, it was created in opposition to the original movement. It's worse than other statements that the right wing have used in reaction to Black Lives Matter, like quote-unquote all lives matter, because instead of just ignoring racism, it seeks to prioritize the lives of the oppressor over the lives of the oppressed. It's a very reactionary way to critique a movement someone has a problem with, and it focuses more on hate than anything else. In the case of Anarchy in the General, Mackin is explicitly anti-fascist, and Armstrong is explicitly a fascist. Anarchy stood for everything anti-general. And what name does Armstrong take up when he's trying to prove himself as a villain? When he's trying to take something and ruin it? He takes up Anarchy. Within the text, it said he did this to become Robin's greatest nemesis. But Anarchy was never Robin's nemesis. With the roles you can notice of these two characters, you see something different. Armstrong saw Anarchy as a threat to the systems he personally was looking to double down on. He personally saw Anarchy as a villain, one of the worst villains he could imagine, a wrench in his goals. So what does he do? He takes him out, takes his name, and makes sure that everyone else sees him as a villain too. That way, if he ever does come back, the people will not see Anarchy as fighting for their voice. All they will see is a villain. And from what we've seen, it seems successful. Even in the times that Anarchy has still been trying to do what's right. Arkham Origins is a good example of this, I feel. Despite the fact that you can see his intentions are noble, he is still portrayed as the villain. He's blowing things up, something that was an Armstrong addition to Anarchy. And instead of simply working in parallel to Batman, he's outright opposition. Not to say that Anarchy never worked in opposition to Batman. He did this often, but that was always more as a result of his methods not agreeing with Batman's, and the idea that in these stories, Batman was more or less trying to uphold the status quo until things could be changed more bureaucratically rather than directly, which tracks for Batman. Every time there's a new vigilante in Gotham City that doesn't 100% subscribe to his way of doing things, they're often in opposition to him. This doesn't just happen to Anarchy, it happens to characters like Spoiler and Huntress too. After just a few issues of Armstrong's Anarchy, Lonnie Macken's Anarchy has been ruined. He has not returned to where he was before. Armstrong took anarchism and turned it into just anarchy. His Anarchy is not anarchy as philosophy, politics, resistance, or methodology. His Anarchy is chaos and violence for the sake of chaos and violence, and his violence is not with the intention of direct action. His violence is the kind that the military-obsessed revel in. It's the excessive display of force over people who did nothing to deserve it. Classic fascists. But while those that aren't looking too deep into the history and terminology can't tell the difference, those who know what they're looking for notice it. Almost immediately, Robin can notice that this is not the Anarchy he knows. This is someone else entirely who does not even understand what the name Anarchy means. And that's also important. The fascist who took over this name, this world, has no actual clue what it means. All he knows is that it's a threat to the systems he worships. He simply does not understand Anarchy in the slightest. Armstrong and Macken are two very opposite ends of the spectrum, but that also doesn't mean there isn't one underlying thing that ties the two together.
You're just a kid.
So, what does it matter? I wanted to make a difference. I thought you'd feel the same.
I do, but not like this. A lot of innocent people almost died tonight because of you.
Innocent? They watched as Gotham went to hell and didn't do a thing!
When Anarchy told Green Arrow that the radicals of one generation are the conservatives of the next, he was especially correct in the Republican Forum. Well, in the 90s, I'm sure that the general was considered absolutely insane. In the year 2025, he sits across from me in science and calls me a whore for wearing a skirt above my knees when the teacher leaves the room. Our youth have, for the past few years, been increasingly radicalized in one direction or the other. Typically, we see the most dramatic changes being that young men are becoming more and more like Armstrong every day. But this doesn't change that there is also an increase in people being radicalized in the other direction, as we see genocides documented on cell phones, and we see the immediate effects of the gunning down of one of the oppressors. Don't let anyone forget that right after the United Healthcare CEO was assassinated, people's claims weren't getting denied nearly as much because the corporations were afraid. Take a good look at Armstrong and Macken. The general was born out of a bloodthirsty worship of violence combined with an obsession with wars past and future. Meanwhile, Anarchy was born out of seeing what the horrors of war looked like from the perspective of an innocent. It's likely that the two researched the same war at one point or another, the general seeing it as an example of might makes right, and Anarchy seeing it as the cause of his friend's suffering. Who the general sees as the great and good, Anarchy sees as the weak and the small. The General also has this level of teenager trying so badly to be edgy that is so thick you could cut it with a knife. He compares himself to the Joker and wants to fill that position in Robin's supporting cast. His obsession with wars and military is an extension of him trying to be edgy and have dark humor. This is the kind of guy who thinks that making horrific jokes about people of color and women is just funny instead of clearly a sign of overt bigotry. Like I said, I've met guys like the General. What they don't realize, though, is that no one's laughing with them. They're all just laughing at them. While Armstrong is so desperate to fill into the Joker position in Robin's life, like the Joker, he sets up Mackin to be able to so easily fit into the Oracle role. The guy he tried to ruin so he could get close to Robin ended up getting closer to him in the process. Sucks to suck. They reflect each other, but really they could not be more different. This sets them up to be a perfect pair within stories and the mythos, to make the audience look at both sides of the spectrum and dissect the two of them both separately and in comparison to one another. You see the General even worse than we usually do when we see him contrasted with Anarchy. Anarchy is, at its core, trying to make change. For Mackin, it's direct action to make the world a better and more equal place, where no one holds power over others. For Armstrong, it's to try and control that world and make it harder for the vision Mackin and others like him strive.
Wonder how things got to be so bad here? I do. All the time. See, I don't think men like Roman Sionis or Oswald Cobblepot are responsible. They're just a reflection of our apathy, our greed, our fear. We look the other way when things turn sour, bury ourselves in our jobs, consume propaganda masquerading as entertainment. The message is always the same. Don't think, don't question. And what becomes of a society that's given up? It rots. Fills up with liars, cheaters, and thugs. Uptown and downtown. The suit in the penthouse is no better than the guy selling drugs in the corner. They're both doing whatever it takes to get ahead. Never mind the cost.
Anarchy, Lonnie Mackin in particular, has always been a very interesting character to me. And I really do hope that he returns to the comic stage in the next few years. It would be a breath of fresh air in today's climate to see him come back. Preferably in some stories featuring Red Robin. Their dynamic is really entertaining. Characters like Lonnie Mackin are deeply compelling to analyze, looking at the ways that real-life belief systems and larger opinions influence the intricacies. Reality always influences art, and so art often reflects reality, consciously or not. Nothing can exist in a vacuum, and that's what it makes it all so special. While I didn't like using New Historicism on books in English class, I did quite enjoy using it on a comic book. Funny how these things happen. I think I just don't like it when people tell me what lens to use. It ruins the fun of analysis. As I do think that's all I have to say, I implore you to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Until next time, listeners.